Chapter 8 of Station Amusements in New Zealand by Lady Mary Anne Barker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 8 Looking for a Congregation. It is to be hoped and expected that such a good understanding has been established between my readers and myself by this time that they will not find the general title of these papers unsuitable to the heading of this particular chapter. Indeed, I may truly say that, looking back upon the many memories of my 3 years' life in that lovely and beloved Middle Island, no pleasure stands out more vividly than my evening rides up winding gullies or across low hill ranges in search of a shepherd's hut or a cockatoo's nest. A peculiar brightness seems to rest on those sunlit peaks of memory's landscape, and it is but fitting that it should be so. For other excursions or expeditions used to be undertaken merely for business or pleasure, but these delicious wanderings were in search of scattered dwellings whose lonely inhabitants, far removed from church privileges for many a long year past, might be bidden, nay entreated, to come to us on Sunday afternoons and attend the service we held at home weekly. And here I feel constrained to say a word to those whose eyes may haply rest on my pages, and who may find themselves in the coming years in perhaps the same position as I did a short time ago. A newcomer to a new country is sure to be discouraged if he or she, particularly she, I fancy, should attempt to revive or introduce any custom which has been neglected or overlooked. This is especially the case with religious observances. At every turn one is met by disheartening warnings. Quote, "Oh, the people here are very different to those in the old country. They would look upon it as an impertinence if you suggested that they should come to church." End quote. Or, quote, "You will find a few may come just at first, and then when the novelty wears off and they have seen all the pretty things in your drawing room, not a soul will ever come near the place." End quote. And, quote, "If even the men don't say something very free and easy to you when you invite them to your house on Sunday afternoons, you may depend upon it that after 2 or 3 weeks you will not know how to keep them in order." End quote. Such, and many more, were the discouraging remarks made when I consulted my neighbours about my plan for collecting the shepherds from the surrounding runs and holding a Church of England service every Sunday afternoon at our own little homestead. To my mind, the distances seemed the greatest obstacle, as many of the men I wanted to reach lived 25 or even 30 miles away, with very rough country between. I had no fear of impertinence, for it is unknown to me, and seldom comes, I fancy, unprovoked. Whilst with regard to the novelty wearing off, and the men ceasing to attend, that must be left in God's hands. We could only endeavour to plant the good seed, and trust to Him to give the increase. It was a great comfort to me in those days that F., who had been many years in the colony, never joined in the disheartening prophecies I have alluded to. Although as naturally averse to reading aloud before strangers as a man who had lived a solitary life would be sure to be, he promised at once, with a good grace, to read the evening service and a sermon afterwards, and thus smoothed one difficulty over directly. His advice to me was precisely what I would fain repeat. Quote, "Try by all means. If you fail, you will at least feel that you have made the attempt." End quote. May all who try succeed, as I did. I believe firmly they will, for it is an undertaking on which God's blessing is sure to rest, and there are no such fertilizing dews as those which fall from heaven. The mists arising from earth are only miasmic vapors, after all. But I fear to linger too long on the end, instead of telling you about the means. It was May when we were fairly settled in our new home at the head of a hill-encircled valley. With us that month answers to your November, but fogs are unknown in that breezy middle island, and my first winter in Canterbury was a beautiful season, heralded in by an exquisite autumn. How crisp the mornings and evenings were, with ever so light a film of hoarfrost, making a splendid sparkle on every blade of waving tussock grass. Then in the middle of the day the delicious warmth of the sun tempted one to linger all day in the open air, and I never wearied of gazing at the strange purple shadows cast by a passing cloud, or up beyond the floating vaporous wreath, to the heaven of brilliant blue which smiled upon us. And yet, when I come to think of it, I don't know that I had much time to spare for glancing at either hills or skies, for we were just settling ourselves in a new place, and no one knows what that means unless they have tried it, 50 miles away from the nearest shop. The yeast alone was a perpetual anxiety to me. It would not keep beyond a certain time, and had a tendency to explode its confining bottles in the middle of the night. So it became necessary to make it in smaller quantities every 10 days or so. If by any chance I forgot to remind my scatterbrained damsels to replenish the yeast bottle, they used up the last drop, and then would come smiling to me with the remark, "There ain't not a drop of yeast about anywhere, mum." This entailed flapjacks or scones, or soda bread, or some indigestible compound for at least 3 days, as it was of no use attempting to make proper bread until the yeast had worked. Then the well needed to be deepened, a kitchen garden had to be made, shelter to be provided for the fowls and pigs, a shed to be put up for coals. 1,000 things, which entailed thought and trouble, had to be done. It is true these rough jobs were not exactly in my line, but indoors I was just as busy trying to make big things fit into little spaces and vice versa. We could not afford to take things coolly and do a little every day, for at that time of year an hour's change in the wind might have brought a heavy fall of snow, or a sharp frost, or a deluge of rain down upon the uncovered and defenceless heads of our live stock. The poor dear sheep, the source of our income, were after all the least well cared for creatures on the station. A well-grassed and watered run, with sunny valleys for winter feeding, and green hills for summer pasturage, had been provided by Antipodean nature for them, and to these advantages we only added some 20 or 25 miles of wire fencing, and then they were left to themselves, with a couple of shepherds to look after 15,000 sheep, all year round. But yet, busy as we were, we found time to look up a congregation. The very first Sunday afternoon, whilst we were still in the midst of a chaos of chips and big boxes, and straw and empty china barrels, our own shepherds came over by invitation, and the only very near neighbours we had, a Scotch head shepherd and his charming young wife, and we held a service in the half-finished drawing-room. After it was ended we had a long talk with the men, and they confessed that they had enjoyed it very much, and would like to come regularly. When questioned as to the feasibility of inducing others to join, they said that it might be suggested to more than one distant, lonely hill shepherd, but his uncontrollable shyness would probably prevent his attendance. Quote, "Jim Salter and Joe Bennett, and a lot more on 'em, would be glad enow to come, if so be they could feel as how they was truly welcome," end quote, said our shepherd Pepper, who prided himself on the elegance and correctness of his phraseology. He added, after a reflective pause, turning bashfully away, quote, "If so be as the lady would just look round and give 'em a call, they'd be to be persuaded belike," end quote. So the scheme was Pepper's after all, you see, but this looking round, to which he alluded so airily, meant scrambling rides, varying from 10 to 28 miles in length, over breakneck country, and this on the slender chance of finding the men indoors. Now, a New Zealand shepherd almost lives out on the hills, so the prospect of finding any of our congregation at home was slight indeed. However, as I said before, F stood by me, and although we neither of us could well spare the time, we agreed to devote 2 afternoons every week, so long as the fine open autumn weather lasted, to make excursions in search of back-country huts. There are no roads or finger-posts or guides of any sort in those distant places. When we inquired what was the name of Mills's shepherd, the masters are always plain Smith or Jones, and the shepherds Mr. in the colonies. The answer was generally very vague. Wiry Bill we mostly calls him, but I think I've heerd say his rightful name was Mr. Pellet, mum. He's a little chap, strong as the 'ouse, explained Pepper, who was an incorrigible cockney, and lives over there, pointing with his thumb to a mountain range behind us. He's in one of them blind gullies. You go along the gorge of the river till you come to a saddle all over fern, and you drop down that, and follow the best of 3 or 4 tracts till you come to a swamp." Here Pepper paused, in consideration of my face of horror, for if there was one thing I dreaded more than any other in those early days, it was a swamp. Steep hillsides, wide creeks, honeycombed flats, all came in the day's ride, but a swamp, ugh, the horrible treacherous thing, so green and innocent looking, with here and there a quicksand or a peaty morass, in which, without a moment's warning, your horse sank up to his withers. It was dreadful, and when we came to such a place, Helen used to stop dead short, prick her pretty ears well forward, and, trembling with fear and excitement, put her nose to the ground, smelling every inch before she would place her forefoot down on it, jumping off it like a goat if it proved insecure. Generally she crossed a swamp by a series of bounds in and out of flax bushes, and hopeless indeed would be a morass without those green cities of refuge. Horrible as a large swamp is, however, to a timid horsewoman, it is dear to the heart of a cockatoo. He gladly buys a freehold of 50 acres in the midst of one, burns it, makes a sod fence sown with gorse seed atop, all round a section, drains it in a rough and ready fashion, and then the splendid fertile soil, which has been waiting for so many thousand years, brings forth fruit abundantly. Such enormous fields of wheat and oats and barley as you come upon sometimes, with, alas, never a market near enough to enable the plenteous crop to return sevenfold into its master's bosom. I shall not inflict upon you a description of all our rides in search of members for our congregation. 2, in widely differing directions, will serve as specimens of such excursions. In consideration of my new chumminess, F selected a comparatively easy track for our first ride, and yet, quote, bad was the best, end quote, might surely be said of that breakneck path. What would an English horse or an English lady say to riding for miles over a slippery winding ledge on a rocky hillside, where a wall of solid mountain rose up perpendicularly on the right hand, and on the left a very respectable-sized river hurried over its boulders far beneath the aerial path? Yet this was comparatively a safe track, and presented but one serious obstacle, over which I was ruthlessly taken. It is perhaps needless to say we were riding in single file, and equally unnecessary to state that I was the last, for certainly we should never have made progress otherwise. Helen, my bay mare, would follow her stable companion, on which F was mounted, so that was the way we got on at all. A sharp sudden turn showed me what appeared to be a low stone wall running down the spur of the mountain, right across our track, and I had already begun to disquiet myself about the possibility of turning back on such a narrow ledge, when I saw F's powerful black horse, with his ears well forward and his reins lying loose on his neck, make a sort of rush at the obstacle, climb up it as a cat would, stand for an instant exactly like a performing goat, with all 4 legs drawn closely together under him, and then, with a spring, disappear on the other side. This wall, I thought, must be but loosely built, for Leo has displaced some of the stones from its coping. Helen, pretty dear, hurried after her friend and leader, and before I had time to realize what she was going to do, she was balancing herself on the crumbling summit of this stone wall, which was only the freak of a landslip, and as it proved impossible to remain there, perched like a bird on a very insecure branch, nothing remained except to gather herself well together and jump off. But what a jump! The ground fell sheer away at the foot of the wall, and left a chasm many feet wide, which the horse could not see until it had climbed to the top of the wall, and as turning back was out of the question, the only alternative was to give a vigorous bound onto the narrow ledge beyond. Terrified as I felt, I luckily refrained from jerking Helen's head, or attempting to guide her in any way. The only chance of safety over New Zealand tracks, or New Zealand creeks, is to leave your horse entirely to itself. I have seen men who were reckoned good riders in England get the most ignominious tumbles from a disregard of this advice. An up-country horse knows perfectly well the only sound spots in a swamp, or the only sound part of a creek's banks. If his rider persists in taking him over the latter, where he himself thinks it narrowest and safest, he is pretty sure to find the earth rotten and crumbling, and to pay for his obstinacy by a wetting, whilst, in the case of a swamp, the consequences are even more serious, and the horse often gets badly strained in floundering out of a quagmire. But it was not all danger and difficulty, and the many varieties of scene in the course of a long ride constituted some of its chief charms. At first, perhaps, after we had left our own fair valley behind, the track would wind through the gorge of a river, with lofty mountains rising sheer up from the water side. All here was sad and grey, and very solemn in its eternal silence, only made more intense by the ceaseless monotonous roar of the ever-rushing water. Then we would emerge on acres and acres of soft rolling downs, higher than the hillocks we call by that name at home, but still marvellously beautiful in their swelling curves, all folding so softly into each other, and dotted with mobs of sheep, making pastoral music to a flock owner's ear. Over this sort of ground we could canter gaily along, with Hector, F's pet collie, keeping close to the heels of his master's horse, for it is the worst of bad manners in a collie to look at a neighbour's sheep. The etiquette in passing through a strange run is for the dog to go on the off side of his master's horse, so that the sheep shall not even see him, and this piece of courtly politeness Hector always practised, of his own accord. A wire fence always proved a very tiresome obstacle, for horses have a great dread of them and will not be induced to jump them on any account. If we could find out where the gate was, well and good, but as it might be half a dozen miles off, on one side or the other, we seldom lost time or patience in seeking it. When there was no help for it, and such a fence had to be crossed, the proceedings were always the same. F dismounted and unfastened one of his stirrup leathers. With this he strapped the wires as firmly as possible together, but if the fence had been lately fresh strained, it was sometimes a difficult task. Still, he generally made one spot lower than the rest, and over this he proceeded to adjust his coat very carefully. He then vaulted lightly over himself, and calling upon me to aid by sundry flicks on Leo's flank, the horse would be induced to jump over it. This was always a work of time and trouble, for Leo hated doing it, and would rather have leapt the widest winter creek than jumped the lowest coat-covered wire fence. Helen had to jump with me on her back, and without any friendly whip to urge her, but except once, when she caught her hind leg in the sleeve of the coat, which was hanging over the fence, and tore it completely out, she got over very well. Upon that occasion, F had to carry his sleeve in his pocket until we reached the neat little outstation hut where Jim Salter lived, and where we were pretty sure to find a housewife, for shepherds are as handy as sailors with a needle and thread. I shall always believe that some bird of the air had carried the matter to Salter, because not only was he at home and in his Sunday clothes, but he had made a cake the evening before, and that was a very suspicious circumstance. However, we pretended not to imagine that we were expected, and Jim pretended with equal success to be much surprised at our visit, so both sides were satisfied. Nothing could be neater than the inside of the little hut, its cob walls papered with old illustrated London news, not only pictures but letterpress, its tiny window as clean as possible, a new sheepskin rug laid down before the open fireplace, where a bright wood fire was sputtering and crackling cheerily, and the inevitable kettle suspended from a hook halfway up the low chimney. Outside, the dog kennels had been newly thatched with towie grass, the garden weeded and freshly dug, the chopping block and camp oven as clean as scrubbing could make them. It was too late in the year for fruit, but Salter's currant, raspberry, and gooseberry bushes gave us a good idea of how well he must have fared in the summer. The fowls were just devouring the last of the green pea shoots, and the potatoes had been blackened by our first frosts. It was all very nice and trim and comfortable, except the loneliness. That must have been simply awful. It is difficult to realize how completely cut off from the society of his kind a New Zealand up-country shepherd is, especially at an outstation like this. Once in every 3 months he goes down to the homestead, borrows the pack-horse, and leads it up to his hut, with a quarter's rations of flour, tea, sugar, and salt. Of course, he provides himself with mutton and firewood, and his simple wants are thus supplied. After shearing, about January, his wages are paid, varying from £75 to £100 a year, according to the locality, and then he gets a week's leave to go down to the nearest town. If he be a prudent, steady man, as our friend Salter was. He puts his money in the bank or lends it out on a freehold mortgage at 10%, only deducting a few pounds from his capital for a suit of clothes, a couple of pair of Cookham boots for hill walking, and above all, some new books. Without an exception, the shepherds I came across in New Zealand were all passionately fond of reading, and they were also well-informed men, who often expressed themselves in excellent, though superfine, language. Their libraries consisted chiefly of yellow-covered novels, and out of my visits in search of a congregation grew a scheme for a book club to supply something better in the way of literature, which was afterwards most successfully carried out. But of this I need not speak here, for we are still seated inside Salter's hut, so small in its dimensions that it could hardly have held another guest. Woman-like, my eyes were everywhere, and I presently spied out an empty bottle labelled Worcester sauce. "Dear me, Salter," I cried, "I had no idea you were so grand as to have sauces up here. Why, we hardly ever use them." "Well, mum," replied Salter bashfully, and stroking his long black beard to gain time to select the grandest words he could think of, "it is hardly to be regarded in the light of happetite, that there bottle. It is more in the nature of remedies." Then, seeing that I still looked mystified, he added, "You see, mum, although we gets our 'ealth uncommon well in these salubrious mountings, still a drop of physic is often handy-like, and in a general way I always purchase myself a box of Holloway's pills, of which you do get so much for a lot of money, and also a bottle of painkiller. But last shearing they was out of painkiller, they said, so they put me up a bottle of cayenne pepper, and likewise that 'ere condiment, which was wery efficacious, especially towards the end of the bottle." "And do you really mean to say you drank it, Salter?" I inquired with horror. "Certainly I do, mum, whenever I felt out of sorts. It always took my mind off the loneliness, and cheered me up wonderful, especially if I hadded a little red pepper to it," said Salter, getting up from his log of wood and making me a low bow. All this time F and I were seated amicably side by side on poor Salter's red blanket-covered bunk, or wooden bedstead, made of empty flour sacks nailed between rough poles, and other sacks filled with tussock grass for a mattress and pillow. The word loneliness gave me a good opening to broach the subject of our Sunday gatherings, and my suspicions of Jim's having been told of our visit were confirmed by the alacrity with which he said, "I have much pleasure in accepting your kind invitation, mum, if so be as I am not intruding." "No, indeed, Salter," F said, "you'd be very welcome, and you could always turn Judy into the paddock whilst we were having service." Now, if there was one thing dearer to Salter's heart than another, it was his little roan mare Judy. Her excellent condition and jaunty little hog mane and tail testified to her master's loving care. So it was all happily settled, and after paying a most unfashionably long visit to the lonely man, we rode away with many a farewell nod and smile. I may say here that Salter was one of the most regular of our congregation for more than 2 years, besides being a member of the book club. In time, its more sensible volumes utterly displaced the yellow paper rubbish in his hut library, and I never can forget the poor man's emotion when he came to bid me good-bye. At my request he made the rough little pen and ink sketches which are here given, and as he held my offered hand, not knowing quite else to do with it, when I took leave of him after our last home service, when my face was set towards England, he could not say a word. The great burly creature's heart must have been nearly as big as his body, and he seemed hardly to know that large tears were rolling down his sunburnt face and losing themselves in his bushy beard. I tried to be cheerful myself, but he kept repeating, "It's only natural you should be glad to go, yet it is very rough upon us." In vain I assured him I was not at all glad to go, very, very sorry in fact. All he would say, to England, home and beauty, in course anyone would be pleased to return. I can't tell you what he meant, and he had no voice to waste on explanations. I only give poor dear Jim's valedictory sentences as they fell from his white and trembling lips. Very different was Ned Palmer, the most diminutive and wiry of hill shepherds, with a tongue which seemed never tired, and a good-humoured smile for everyone. Ned used to try my gravity sorely by stepping up to me 6 times during the service to find his place for him in his prayer book, and always saying aloud, "Thank you kindly, End of chapter 8.